Black radical tradition. As the formation that I'm a part of locally, one of our goals is to engage with Black radical tradition. Because where I live, it's important because that element is being played out in the engagement of some Black communists and Black people that engage with revolutionary thoughts and theory. So, all right, let's get started, everybody. Wish me luck on the reading. Again, I have a hard time with pronouncing names and places. And sometimes I see a word and it's not the word. So bear with me, everybody. Slavery, democracy. We have already noted how the idea of slavery to Du Bois's mind was opposed to the ideals of democracy. The ideology necessary to rationalize slavery disallowed the further development of liberal democracy except as a myth. But Du Bois understood that the relationship between slavery and democracy was not a question of the clash of ideas. His approach to history was similar to this respect to that which Marx and Engels had presented in the German ideology. The German ideology was a critique of left Hegelianism and idealism. And it's one of Marx's places where he moves to outside of left Hegelianism into the materialist dialectics position. This conception of history comes to the conclusion that all forms and products of consciousness cannot be dissolved by mental criticism, by resolution into self-consciousness, for transformation into apparitions, specters, fancies, etc., but only by the practical overflow of the actual social relations which give rise to this idealistic humbug. For Du Bois, the creation of those political institutions and structures identified with American democracy involved congruence with the country's economic character, that is, with the slave system and capitalism. And so, though the American Constitution reflects the power of plantocracy, plantocracy, which is plantations, only in its
plantocracy.
Thank you. Only in its device for electoral representation that had been sufficient advantage for the domination of the federal government by the class during the Republic's first several decades. This had meant a domination by a class that consisted of 7% of the South's population. Hold on a second, I think I have someone coming in. Maybe it could be, no, I don't know who that is. It had in American history chosen 11 out of 16 presidents, 17 out of 28 judges of the Supreme Court, 14 out of 19 attorney generals, 21 out of 33 speakers of the House, 80 out of 134 foreign ministers. Consequent to this power, the plutocracy had established a legal structure that effectively eliminated the civil rights of the 9 million Black and poor white workers to be found in the South in the mid-19th century. This perversion of the apparatus of representative democracy had survived the Civil War and the Reconstruction and had persisted into the next century despite the challenges of populism, organized labor, political radicalism, the Depression, the mass black movement of the UNIA. I think he's talking about, when he talks about the apparatus, he's talking about the superstructure. Federalism, I think he is. That's what I'm getting. Federalism had evolved into states' rights, the ideological dressing of the first slavery, and then the Black Codes, Jim Crow, and more contemporary forms of repression. Each shift in the apparatus of repression had been associated with the changing forms of exploitation as Black people moved from being slaves to being sharecroppers, peons, and finally to being proletariats or a labor reserve. In the North, the dictatorship of property, quote unquote, had been manifested in capital and investment, not as rich or as powerful as the plutocrats in the beginning. The northern merchants, manufacturers, and industrialists had developed on the backs of Southern culture and European labor. The North exploited its labor more efficiently, not having to absorb the cost of developing it during the non-productive years. Those costs were occurred by the socio-economic sectors of Ireland, Germany, Italy, and England. The North supplied the middlemen between the South and its European and domestic markets. It supplied the shipping and transportation for the South's produce. It was also in the process of developing a national economy of total integration before the Civil War, while the South was becoming increasingly dependent. In the world market, the merchants and manufacturers had all the advantages of unity, knowledge, and purpose, and could hammer down the price of raw material. The slaveholders, therefore, saw northern merchants and manufacturers enrich themselves from the result of Southern agriculture. His capitalist rivals of the North were hardworking, simple living, zealots, devoting their whole energy and intelligence to building up the industrial system. They quickly monopolized transport and mines and factories, and they were more than willing to include the big plantations. The result was that North and European industry set prices for Southern cotton, tobacco, and sugar, which left a narrow margin of profit for the planters. Capital, both industrial and financial, continued to grow until the northern industrialists could challenge the political powers of the plutocrats, and while it grew, it too undermined the structures of democracy. The North had yielded to democracy, but only because democracy was curbed by the dictatorship of property and investment, which left in the hands of the leaders of industries such economic power as ensured their mastery and their profits. Less than this, they knew perfectly well they could not yield, and more than this, they would not. Once the industrial class emerged as dominant in the nation, it possessed not only its only bias of power and social relations historically related to that power, but it also had available to it the instruments of oppression created by the non-subordinate Southern ruling class. In its struggle with labor, it could activate racism to divide the labor movement into antagonistic forces. Moreover, the permutation of the instrument appeared endless: black against white, Anglo-Saxons against Southern and Eastern European, domestic against immigrant, proletariat against sharecropper, white Americans against Asian, black, Latino Americans, and so on, in my verse Visibility. Yeah, whatever. It's gonna fail it anyways. Who cares? Who's this? I don't know you, George. Reconstruction and the Black elite. Yes, I have studied dialectical materialism, and I'm still studying dialects. Reconstruction and the Black elite. One of the most revealing aspects of Black Reconstruction was Du Bois' assessment of the Black petty bourgeoisie, that element of Black society with which he had been most closely associated for the most of his then 67 years. For the first time in public pronouncements, he was resolved to expose the extent to which his beloved elite, through the logic of its own development, had moved apart from the Black masses. As he reckoned it, the process of bourgeoisification, I can't say it, and alienation that had begun during slavery had not revealed its contradictions until the Reconstruction. Suddenly, the petite bourgeoisie were confronted with the political expressions of black labor. Okay, no one's in there. Maybe when I'm done reading, you can come up, we can talk about it. The differences that now came was that it's indefinitely large number of black people that even before was enfranchised, suddenly the 99% of them belong to the laboring class. Whereas by law, black people who voted in the earlier history of the country were for the most part property holders and perspective, if not actually constituents of a petty bourgeoisie. Still, during these first heady days following the emancipation of the ending of the Civil War, the black petty bourgeoisie was presumed to lead. Quite soon, however, its ideological and political vacuity, wait, what's that word? Yeah, it's not approved. Vacuity had begun to be apparent. Its leadership nominal, and at its best, mere mediation between the demands of the black masses and the power of the ruling classes. When freedom came, this mass of black labor was not without intelligent leadership, and the leadership which because of former race prejudice and the present color line could not be divorced from the laboring masses, as had been the case with the poor whites. Free black people from the North, most of whom had been born in the South, and new conditions came back in considerable numbers during the Reconstruction and took their place as leaders. The result was that black people were not as they were sometimes painted, simply a mass of densely arrogant toilers. It was, however, a leadership which was not at all clear in its economic thought. On the whole, it believed to be accumulation of wealth and the exploitation of labor as the normal method of economic development. But it also believed in the right to vote as the basis of defense of economic life. And gradually but surely, it was forced by the demand of the mass of black people, black laborers, to face the problem of land. Thus, black leaders gradually but certainly turned towards emphasis on economic emancipation. Inevitably, however, even these tenuous links between the elite strata and the black labor had disintegrated. Du Bois, who believed he understood the forces that had made a mockery of the racial solidarity that had been the elite's evangelism, basically like preaching and stuff, right? Evangelicalism. First, there was the ambivalence of the black petty bourgeoisie. It's like the starting points of basically a comprador class that represents the colony of black people. The black person owned black leadership was naturally of many sorts. Some, like the whites, were petty bourgeoisie, seeking to climb to wealth. Others were educated men, helping to develop a new nation without regard to mere race lines. While in the third group were idealists, trying to uplift the black race and put them on a par with the whites. In the minds of very few of them was there any clear and distinct plan for the development of the laboring class into a position of power and mastery over the modern industrial state. Oh, you didn't last long. Damn. They were to pay sometimes with their lives when the changing order of privilege concomitant to the continuing development of northern industrial wealth left them vulnerable. The bargain of 1876 left capital as represented by the old planter class, the new northern capitalist, and the capitalists that began to rise out of the poor whites, with a control of labor greater than any modern industrial state in civilized hands. In civilized hands. A lawlessness which in 1865 to 1868 was still spasmodic and episodic, now became organized, and its real underlining industrial causes obscured by political excuses and race hatred, using a technique of mass and midnight murders. The South began widely organizing aggression upon black people. Armed guerrilla warfare killed thousands of black people. Political riots were staged. Their cause or occasions were always obscured. Their results always certain. 10 of 100 times as many black people were killed as whites. The violence and terror that descended upon black people during the 50 years that followed Reconstruction left black elites shaken and pared down to its opportunists. Black people did not surrender the ballot easily or immediately, but it was a losing battle, with public opinion, industry, wealth, and religion against them. Their own leaders decried politics, quote unquote, and preached submission. All their efforts towards... I know, it's because I'm restricted right now. That's why. You're in the middle of me being restricted. That's why, brain rot. All their efforts towards many self-assertions were distracted by defeatism and counsel of despair, backed by the powerful propaganda of a religion which taught meekness, sacrifice, and humility. This brings us to the situation when Booker T. Washington became the leader of the black race and advised them to depend upon industrial education and work rather than politics. The better class of Southern black people stopped voting for a generation. Through its wealth, the educational institution of black elites survived, growing more remote from the black masses of black people as its ability to reproduce itself developed. They avoided the mistake of trying to meet force by force. They bent to the storm of beating, lynching, and murder, and kept their souls in spite of public and private insults of every description. They built an inner culture which the world recognizes, in spite of the fact that it is still half strangled and inarticulate. Yeah, you're right. In this relative social isolation, its culture continued to adopt forms from the class peers, from which it was estranged by race. But by the constant terror, the entire black community had been turned in on itself. And by the presence of poverty, its social stratification had been stabilized. However, the sources of the black community were too few to support a mobility of more than incremental significance. With black migration to the north and west, which occurred at the turn of the century, this situation would change, but only slightly. Meanwhile, though Du Bois could still not admit it, the idealism of the black petty bourgeoisie had been transformed into an ideology that served to hold the black community as a semi-preserve for the more effective exploitation by the elites. As he had made clear at the Rosenwald Conference, racial solidarity still overrode a radical critique of his class. We must rid ourselves of the persistent idea that the advance of mankind consists of a scale off of layers who become incorporated with the world's upper and middle and ruling classes, leaving always dead and inert below the arrogant, ignorant, and unenlightened mass of men. Our professional classes are not aristocrats. and our masters. They are and must be the most efficient of our servants and thinkers, whose legitimate reward is the advancement of the great mass of American black people, and with them, the uplift of all men. Du Bois, Marx, and Marxism. There is, however, a final aspect of the significance in black reconstruction that demands close attention. From the vantage point of a black radical historiography, Du Bois was one of the first American theorists to sympathetically confront Marx's thought in critical, independent terms, undaunted by the political and personal concerns of black people in America, an American Communist Party, which frequently manifests themselves as a search for ideological orthodoxy. In their work and writings, Du Bois had little reason or awareness of cautiously threading an ideological position between Rothenberg, Lovestone, and Foster in the CPUSA, or Trotsky, Bukharin, and Stalin in the Communist International. As such, he could attempt to come to terms with Marx himself, unmediated by Lenin or the emerging doctrines to be known as Marxist Leninism. And in so doing, he was articulating in theoretical terms the intersections between the black radical tradition and historical materialism, only vaguely hinted at the formal organization of the time. It was in those then irreconcilable roles as a black radical thinker and as a sympathetic critic of Marx that Du Bois was to make some of his most important contributions concerning black social movements. However, unless we continue to invoke a consciousness of the historical moment in which Du Bois was working, we have little chance of recognizing the nature of thought to which he addresses himself in Black Reconstruction. Since its inception, Marxism has meant to some of critical scientific systems, a way of understanding, comprehending, the affecting history. The way in which Trotsky expresses his own excitement about Marxism underscores this point. I'm not a Trotsky, everybody. Not a Trot. The important thing to see clearly, one can say of communism above all, that it gives more clarity. We must liberate man from all the that all prevents his seeing. The history of Marxist thought and Marxist organization, however, was more ambiguous, concomitant with this presumed clarity. This way of seeing was the emergence of its corrosive, its opposition. The nature of change argued in Marxism, the dialectic, would lead one to anticipate such oppositions to occur in Marxism. I don't know about that. Especially with the appearance of political dogma, historical certainty, and epistemological variations of empiricism, which we don't agree with as Marxism. We believe in empirical data. The history of Marxist thinkers has confirmed this expectation. This is not merely a question of distinguishing the true Marxists, that is, the founders, Marx and Engels, from this less gifted opinionage. It is not an intellectual or theoretical problem. Dogma, certainly, and facticity were social and political phenomena. In Marxism, they have emerged out of the context of specific organizational demands, a definite collective and individual need framed by particular historical and political dynamics. And it was with respect to these phenomena, as they had manifested themselves in American Communist Party organization in the late 1920s and early 1930s, that Du Bois focused his work on revolutionary theory. Now, the Comintern did tell that the U.S. to stop, that they need to answer the question of the black masses. So they were told to stop being fucking racist. Marxism is adaptable to the conditions. That's the whole point of it. It adapts to the conditions and sees different contradictions that are engaged in the production of these things. So Marx does observe these things. They just needed a push. And that's why we have Pan-African Marxists, we have Marxists from the global South that utilize the Marxist methodology to critique their condition. So we have Addison's, like, even though he's not a Marxist, not yet, some people say he could have been, Fanon as to the dialect of the material condition. So anyways, to understand the significance of Marxist thoughts of what Du Bois was doing, it is only necessary to recall that the American Communist Party in the 1930s was situated in the most advanced capitalist society in the world. Consequently, it was soon to be the second most important communist party in the world, displacing the German movement, but behind the Bolsheviks. So the German movement got betrayed. And you see that they went into fascism. They went into Nazism. So if the German proletariat and the Communist Party was able to overcome this, we might be seeing a different society right in front of us. Might. To Marxist communists, the historical role of the CPUSA had been determined by the principle of Leninism, because that was the advancement of Marxism. Leninism was putting Marxism in practical use. Because you have to put the theory, you have to put it in practical use to find out if the theory is sound. Just watch it living and breathing as it moves and identifies contradictions and solves those contradictions. It was the vanguard of the most advanced proletariat movement. It was this party ideological dogma, its existential creed and theoretical orthodoxy as they related to black people that compelled Du Bois to a reassessment of Marx, which is always good. It's always good. Poppy, hey, GI. The first war of the world in the 20th century, it was watershed for those events that directly influenced the special character of the American Communist movement and the party's policy towards black people. It was during the war, or because of the war, or in the aftermath of the war that these events occurred. First, there was a transformation of international socialism, the Comintern, succeeding the Second International, as a leading force of the socialist movement. Second, in the United States, black immigration from the South resulted in the formation of northern urban black communities, and subsequently a new form of racial consciousness, black nationalism. Third, beginning most simultaneously with the formation of the American Party, there was the intercession of the Comintern, Lenin, and then Stalin on the black question. These were the critical events. It is necessary now to look at them more in detail. So this is where they're trying to figure out and have an analysis of black people. Yeah, good to see you too. Bolshevism and American communism. And like I'm sorry, but the critique is that they fell into that they had to be told by the Comintern to stop being racist, basically. So they fell into the American exceptionalism of racial disparity. So they did. They faltered to that. Bolshevism and the American Communist Party. The Second International succumbed to two forces, nationalism and revolutionary failure. So like, this is one of the things that the left comms take. They think that, and I'm starting to see it too, that Stalin took a national kind of viewpoint, kind of retreated, doing the socialism in one state. And I fear in my analysis that that's where the division and the coexistence started going. Coexistence with the Western world started to deteriorate the Bolshevik movement, in my assessment. The Second International succumbed to, oh yeah, I already got it. With regards to nationalism, World War I found the majority of the workers of England, Germany, France, and Austro-Hungary willing to go to the battlefields under national leadership in order to fight against each other. International worker solidarity upon which socialism was based disintegrated, which I agree. The socialist movement had failed to maintain the dichotomy between the interests of the workers of the interests of capitalist ruling classes. State nationalism had triumphed as a dominant ideology of the working classes. The pacifist tactics of the socialists had proved to be effective only in those countries that were neither non-combatants or those like the United States, which had been slowly to enter the fray. Moreover, the revolutionary movement led the socialists failed. All that is but one. The Bolshevik Party had gained control over the revolution in Russia, but Germany, England, France, and Hungary, and elsewhere, socialist revolutions either failed to materialize, or when they did, were aborted. Thus, in the most advanced industrialized societies, the presumed site of revolution, no revolution were brought about, no worker movement came to power. In point of fact, the only two successful revolutions of the period had occurred in societies whose populations were predominantly peasants, Mexico and Russia. Not only were the predominantly peasant societies, but peasant movements had played critical roles in the triumphs of the revolution, throwing into question the presumption of that industrial worker were to be the instruments of philosophy, quote unquote. It is not surprising then that organization of the international socialist movement atrophied. Yep. The Second International had also come increasingly to represent or signify that revolution would come through the instruments of structures of bourgeois society, political reform through the institutions of bourgeoisie democracy. Ew. This sounds like reformism. When the international collapsed, so did the tactical and ideological resolution. What appeared to replace then? It was the Third International, dominated by Lenin and the policies of the Bolshevik cadre. Tactically, a renewed commitment to violent struggle became evident in the movement. Moreover, with the formation of the Third International, it became necessary for member national parties to pledge their loyalties to the Comintern, the Soviet Union, and, in practical terms, to the Bolshevik Party. The defense of the Soviet Union was to be the highest priority, and this is where the failing, I think, happens. This is what a lot of the other people that are like ultra-left Leninists say. Party discipline, I think, was to conform to the dictates of the executive committee of the Comintern, the committee chaired by Zonayev, and the second leading Bolshevik. Each party desirous of affiliating with the Communist International should be obliged to render every possible assistance to the Soviet republics in their struggle against all counter-revolutionary forces. The Communist Party should carry on a precise and definite propaganda to induce the workers to refuse to transport any kind of military equipment intended for fighting against the Soviet Republic, and should also be legal and illegal means carried on a propaganda amongst the troops sent against the Workers' Republic, etc. All the resolutions of the Congress of the Communist International, as well as the resolution of the Executive Committee, are binding for all parties joining the Communist International. Still, the vigor with which the Comintern pursued the institutionalized its hegemony had no immediate effect on the American communist movement. The history of the organization of revolutionary socialist and workers' movements in the United States had been so desperate for any authority, domestic or otherwise, to impose cohesion and or subordination. The crucial social basis for radical workers' movements in the United States was provided by the forces of labor recruited to American industrial production. Commenting on the first decade and a half of the 20th century, Nathan Glazer argued, one central fact about the American working class in this period and during subsequent decades, too, must be remembered. It was largely composed of immigrants. The working force in the steel mills, the coal mines, the textile factories, the clothing shops, as was overwhelmingly foreign-born, and that part of it that was not was concentrated in supervisory jobs and in the more highly paid skilled occupations. Earlier, as we have seen, the African and Afro-American agrarian workers had supplied the critical surplus value that supported the transformation of the economy into an industrialized and ultimately capital intensive one. Let's see here. I was going to say something. So surplus is the extra thing that is not required to maintain or to engage with society. Surplus is the extra things that workers produce, create, and also give time to for the benefits of the ruling class and the capitalist class. Entered late 19th century, European immigrants expropriated, trained, reproduced, and disciplined by European sectors of the world economy in Germany, England, Ireland, and Italy primarily, constituted the labor forces uniquely developed the historical necessary for the American industrial transformation, which caused for slavery and exploitation. But most of these European immigrants, workers, had come from societies in which labor movements were already developed. In fact, most of these movements had, by the mid-19th century, developed unique and particular complexities of tactics, strategies, and ideology. Whole traditions of these labor movements and opposition in those traditions had been achieved. These were a part of the political, organizational, and ideological cultures that accompany the foreign workers to America. Theodore Draper observes, from the very outset, the American socialist movement was particularly indebted to the immigrants for both its progress and its problems. The first convention of the Socialist Labor Party in 1877 was composed of representatives of 17 German sections, 7 English, 3 Bohemian, 1 French, and a general women's section. Immigrants naturally assumed the role of teachers and organizers, but they were mainly concerned with teaching and organizing themselves. The Socialist Labor Party was never more than an American head on a immigrant body. Hello, welcome. As these people dispersed and or concentrated in the United States according to the various social and economic determinants, their traditions were either conserved, adopted, or dissipated. Two ways in which they were conserved were through ethnic specific and industrial specific communities. The labor movement, where it was trade unionists, electoral parties, or revolutionary, was largely organized on the basis of national, ethnic, and industrial groups. In the Socialist Party of 1914, the membership of the Northeast and Midwest states was largely Jewish, Germans, Polish people, Czechoslovakians, and Slovakians, Hungarians, South Slavic people, and many others. Later immigrant groups, however, formed parties or groupings that were still related to the Socialist Party of their respective countries, of which so many had been members. This federation of immigrant workers played a special role in American socialism. This, then, was one crucial contradiction in early American socialist development. And my next appeal. Let's see if I win this one, guys. Do you think I'll win this one? Let's find out. The organizing principle was ethnicity, while at the same time nationalism. A local conclusion of ethnicity endangered and frustrated the socialist unity. Ethnicity dominated the movement organizationally, ideologically, and conceptually, and theoretically. This collective contradiction was at presented character of the socialist and labor movement.
Drew, communist?
What?
This objective contradiction was a persistent character.
Thank you. This objective contradiction was a persistent character of the socialist and labor movement and would reach critical proportions in response to both European and American events. i.e. the Francisco-Prussian War in the 1870s, World War I, and ethnic competition for jobs and its subsequent violence. Even among the minority section of the socialist movement, the English Language Federation, there was a basic conflict between nationalism and socialism. Much of the membership of these federation was in fact made up from second-generation immigrant clusters. Among the factors involved in the decision of becoming socialists and communists, Gabriel Allman, hey, I didn't approve, argued was that assimilative motive. Allman maintained that the English Language Federation were influenced by both the organizational priority of Americanization so as to influence the development of a Native American working class and their members' own psychological needs. The American Communist Party was formed during a time of some theoretical and ideological confusion. In point of fact, the movement in the United States had broken down into so many competing ideological functions in the earlier 1920s that it became necessary for the Comintern to impose order, unite them into a single party. The party that resulted was dominated by foreign language federations, the most powerful being the Russian and Finnish federations. The federations, though, were still often more concerned with the fortunes of the movement in their homelands than in America. Nationalism and nationalist rivalries were consequently a part of the party's historical character. When one adds to the situation the disputes inherited from the Second International concerning the nature of capitalism and the form of socialist revolution, would assume the appearance of Bolshevik hegemony, can be understood to have been both a further force for chaos and order. The success of the Bolshevik Party gave the Russian language association an advantage for a time in the influencing party policy, but it also intensified ideological disputes and theoretical quarrels, since the Bolsheviks were a historical anomaly in classic Marxist terms. But the form of Russian nationalism had assumed dominance in the American movement as it had throughout the Comintern. Though this idea was acceptable to many of the American movement, it could also be accepted to encounter opposition, especially among those people who had been historically subjects to the Tsarist Russia's imperialism. In a movement dominated by national parties, the sub-parties, the character of the Comintern and the subsequent inflation of the political influence of Russian national in the United States was bound to produce a revitalized counter-nationalism. The growing power of specifically Russian Jewish people in the movement created or exacerbated cleavages within the communist movement that were not resolved even by the late 1920s. Regardless the direct influence of the Bolsheviks on the American movement that had begun as early as the late 1916s, months before its own spectacular successes, and nearly 3 years before the first Congress of the Communist International, would seldom be seriously challenged in the next 40 or 50 years. Here we go. Any questions?
Said what I said of what I think's going on with the American Communist parties, that we're too broken up. We need to be pulled together.
Yeah, we're too broken up and we have too many splinters and splits and factions and campism. Yeah, I think it's on purpose. I think it's they're purposely done, because what we should do, in my personal opinion, is retreat back to the basis of things and go from there and see if, like, these questions, like, is this viable in our conditions? Let's find out. Let's actually observe this. I think we need to do that stuff. I think it's not a bad thing, because then I think we can figure out universalities and how to employ those according to the dialectics and the conditions of the society. So I don't know. I'm completely wrong. I am not a professional revolutionary. So I'm far beyond that. There's so many people that are like so far advanced in this. But we should have these talks and these conversations, these ideological struggles with each other. To find some continuity with one another. I don't know. I could be naive. Who knows? Black nationalism. So black nationalism is a condition for black communities to identify a struggle for liberation. So black nationalism doesn't hit the same way as like quote unquote white nationalism. White nationalism is based in keeping capitalist relations and also exploitation, slavery, and racism. Because, yeah. All right, black nationalism. For black people, in sociological and political terms, one of the most important events in American history at the time of the First World War was the migration to the sites of urban and particularly northern industries. With the outbreak of the war, the European immigration of laborers had been severely restricted by both the exigencies of war and congressionally imposed controls. In addition, wartime conscriptions had removed thousands of white workers from their jobs, while at the same time war was opening markets to the U.S. goods and increasing the demand for labor. The war then produced a labor scarcity in the American industry. In such a labor market, workers had an advantage of their demands for wage increases. And as the term of the war lengthened, job action as a labor tactic became more diffused among workers, including the semi-skilled. Northeastern industrialists and their counterparts in the Midwest attempt to resolve the problem of increasing labor costs and labor militancy by recruiting Southern and Caribbean black people. As we had noted, at this time, the overwhelming majority of American black people lived in the rural South, despite the campaigns of terror and violence directed against them, and which had been the constant undercurrent in their lives since the Reconstruction. Most of them were still reluctant to break historical, social, and cultural ties by migrating to confrontations with northern antipathies. Who? I know, I'm looking. I gotta look this up. It's a little hard. It's antipathetic, my bad. To meet this problem, corporate managers and developed a sophisticated propaganda campaign to excite the interest of Southern black workers. Labor recruiters were sent south with instructions to fill the empty freight cars, often accompanied by them. Black newspapers, some subsidized by Northern industrialists, led by the Chicago Defender, ran articles on the opportunities for employment in the North juxtaposed with accounts of anti-black activities of Southern whites. Robert Abbott, editor of the Defender, was relentless. Abbott put out a, quote, national edition of his weekly aim to Southern black people. It carried in red ink such headlines as 100 black people murdered weekly in United States by white American lynching, a national disgrace, and white gentlemen grapes, women of color, girls. Accompanying a lynching story was a picture of the lynch victim's severed head with the caption, "Not Belgium, America." Poems entitled Land of Hope and Bound of the Promised Land urged black people to go north. The editorials boasted. So they were just opportunists. They didn't really mean it. They were just opportunists trying to get them to move. Editorial boosted Chicago as the best place for them to go.
Want ads offered jobs at attractive wages in around Chicago. In news items, anecdotes, cartoons, and photos, the defender crystallized the underlying economic and social causes of black suffering into immediate motives for flight. So they fucking just propagandized that shit. The promise of economic integration into some of the most advanced sectors of American production had its impact. As noted, the estimated 250,000 to 1 million black workers and their families migrated during the war years, substantially increasing the population of black communities situated in a crucial industrial area east of the Mississippi. This migratory flood coincided with one emanating from the English-speaking Caribbean. The poverty and deteriorating well-being of Caribbean black people were the direct legacy of colonialism. Tens of thousands of Caribbeans came to the United States during the first decade of the 20th century because they were being colonized. It was work too that attracted them. And so they located in precisely the same black communities that received the internal migration. Hold on a second. Don't worry. Yeah. One unusual and complicated feature of the New York ghetto of Harlem was a presence of two quite different non-white populations. By far, the larger was the group of Southern migrants, but the minority not to be ignored had originated in the Caribbean islands, chiefly the British Caribbean, with some of the Dutch Caribbeans, Cuba and Puerto Rico. To the 5,000 foreign-born black people who lived in New York in 1900s were added 28,000 more during the war decade. In 1917, the New York Times estimated that they formed 1/4 of the population of Harlem. The congregating of these people, the deep disruptions that accompanied their translocation, and the persistent hostility with which they were confronted forced them onto each other politically and socially. As such, it became necessary for them to develop social and political forms that would transcend the particularistic identities due to the specific historical differences. It was within the particular milieu that both the UNIA and the African Blood Brothers, ABB, emerged, and both would have enormous consequences for the American Communist Party's effort to organize black people. It has never been possible to characterize the United Black People Improvement Association, they use the N-word, in precise terms. Its dominant ideology was electric, incorporating elements of Christianity. Hold on. You have to do a puzzle now. And of course, I fucked up the first one. And I got the second one. Association in terms. Its dominant ideology was electric, incorporating elements of Christianity, socialism, revolutionary nationalism, and race solidarity. It was as an organization, it exhibited a range of structures responsive to circumstances and personalities. Responsibility for police and decision-making varied as well. They were formed in accordance with ideological factors, the circumstances of situational crucial individuals, the nature of the issues, and the momentary fortunes of the organization. 2, the organization did change over time, responding to the political and social significance of the interactions between itself and its social and political environment. Nevertheless, observers have most frequently typified the organization as ideologically a back to Africa, quote unquote, movement, or for very different reasons, with a implicit organizational characterization as, quote, the Garvey movement. That's Pan-African. That's the, yeah. It was never quite so obviously simple. The UNIA's main thrust appears to have been towards the development of a black power nation, economically organized by a modified form of capitalism. This powerful entity was to become the guardian of the interests of black people in Africa, where it was to be located, and those dispersed in the African diaspora. The nation was to be found on a technocratic elite recruited from black peoples of the world. This elite, in turn, would create the structures necessary for the national survival and its development until it was strong enough to play its historical role, and absorb and generate subsequent generations of trained, disciplined nationalists. As a number of historians have noted, in many ways, both directly and indirectly, the UNIA had incorporated the elements of self-help movement identified with Booker T. Washington, but without the restrictions imposed upon the movement. The UNIA had pushed the concept of its local conclusion. Now, nationalism has to advance into a international character seeking socialism and seeking to abolish any class relations of capitalism. So it's a touchy subject in some cases when it comes to nationalism, on some cases, because Frantz Fanon also observed that nationalism could turn into a bourgeoisie replicating capitalism and keeping the exploitation of the system going. He has two different positions it can take, at least in the stuff I've read. The UNIA had possessed a proto-national bureaucracy, security forces with women, auxiliaries, a national church, an international network of chapters, or consulates, and in the beginning, of an economic base consisting of a series of small businesses and service industries. Those are small business service industries would be petit bourgeois. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of black people were enrolled in the organization, though recruitment went on primarily in the United States and in the Caribbean islands. The UNIA possessed dues-paying members in Africa and Latin America. The scale of the organization made the UNIA by far away the largest nationalist organization to emerge from black people in America. In these terms, the organization's significance still remained unrivaled in U.S. history, since most histories of the organization were written by its critics. Distortion of the UNIA abound in the literature. They are especially marked with regard to its founder, the principal organizer, Marcus Garvey. Even Du Bois, while participating in the opposition to the UNIA, had contributed exposes of its financial practices and bitter characterization of Garvey. But the one predominant tactic of the UNIA's critics was to identify the organization with Garvey, thus tending to reduce their criticisms to studies, an aberrant personality, or political opportunism. Robert Bagnall, one such critic, writing in a Philip Randolph's and Chandler Owens paper, The Messenger, described Garvey as a Jamaican black person of unmixed stock, stocky, fat and sleek, with protruding jaws and heavy jowls, small, bright, they used an animal-like eyes, and rather boastful, egotistic, tyrannical, intolerant, cunning, shifty, smooth, and suave, avaricus, I can't say that word, as adept as a cuttlefish in beclouding an issue he could not meet, prolix in the 9th degree of devising new schemes to gain the money of poor, arrogant black people, gifted at self-advertisement without shame and self-laudation, promising ever but never fulfilling, without regard for veracity, a lover of pomp, a tawdry finery of garnished display, a bully with his own folks, but surveil in the presence of the clan, a sheer opportunist, a demagogic charlatan. That was that one person. With more clarity came to the same point Claudia McKay would write in his Harlem, Black Metropoles. The movement of Marcus Garvey in Harlem was glorious with romance of riotous, clashing emotion. Like the wise men of the ancient world, this peacock, parading black person of the new world, hoodooed by the black normacy, I used the N-word, of Africa, followed a star, a black star, a weaver of dreams. He translated into a fantastic pattern of reality of gaudy strain of the voracious desire of the submergent member of the black race. There has never been a black leader like Garvey. None ever enjoyed a fraction of his universal popularity. He winged his way into a ferment of the white world, holding aloft a black star and exhorting the black people to gaze upon and follow it. In this way, the UNIA became known as, quote, the Garvey movement. This was always implied or bespoken the presence of autocratic authority and demagoguery. As a principal spokesman and symbol of the UNIA, Garvey became the object of study rather than the masses of the people involved in making the organization. Robert Hill, Tony Martin, and Theodore Vincent are three historians who have recently begun to correct the fault. The UNIA official demands sit down in the Declaration of Rights of the black peoples of the world include the right to vote, a fair share of political patrons, representation on juries and on the judges' bench, and full freedom of press, speech, and assembly for all. The UNIA sought these basic freedoms primarily to create and strengthen the separate black world, while groups like the NAACP would utilize these freedoms primarily to create an integrated world. Socially, the UNIA was a huge club and fraternal order for Garveyites. There was the fraternal camaraderie of all the black people of the world. UNI parades, Saturday night parties, women's group luncheons, etc. had a significance far beyond that provided social diversion. Their affairs were designed to build a pride and confidence in blackness. Clearly, the UNIA possessed the substantial cadre and several tiers of secondary leadership. It was a complex organization functioning on a number of levels simultaneously, and its popular appeal and attractive political styles were combined with pragmatic programs of racial achievement for the 5 years of its peak development from 1918 to 1923, it became the most formidable movement in history of American black people. Like the UNIA, the organizational cadre of the African Brotherhood consisted largely of Caribbean, indigenous people, Afro-Americans who had developed professionally as a social agitator and journalist propagandist. It found organization in 1919 where Cyril Bridges, Nevis Island, Richard D. Moore, Barbados, and W.A. Domingo, Jamaica. Later in the period between 1920 and 1922, Otto Huswand, Suriname, and a number of important Afro-American radicals joined the movement, including Otto Hall, Harry Hayward, Edward Doughty, Grace Campbell, H.V. Phillips, Gordon Owens, Alonzo Isabel, and Lovett Fort Whiteman. The largest membership was in the New York Home Office, but there were sizable contingents in Chicago, Baltimore, Omaha, and West Virginia. The ABB also established groups in the Caribbean area, in Trinidad, Suriname, British Guiana, Santo Domingo, and the Windward Islands. At its height, the ABB had only 3,000 to 5,000 members, most of them ex-servicemen. The number was kept small in the party by design, but the possibilities of danger and the Brotherhood's militantly nationalistic and left-wing ideology undoubtedly alienated and confused many people. The ABB saw itself as a tight-knit, semi-clandestine paramilitary group which hoped to act for a worldwide federation of black organization. The Brotherhood's official program stated, in part, quote, "In order to build a strong and effective movement on the platform of liberation for black people, protection of their rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, etc. All black organizations should get together on a federation basis, thus creating a united, centralized movement. For the bulk of its dozen-odd years of existence, the ABB was a secret paramilitary organization dedicated to the immediate protection and ultimate liberation of black people everywhere. This aspect of its ideology, however, was not a true reflection of its origins or future. When the Brotherhood was first proposed in Briggs's monthly magazine, The Crusader, it was designated that African Blood Brothers, quote, for African liberation and redemption, end quote. Even earlier, though, The Crusader had advertised itself as a public publicity organ and a Hematic League of the World. June 1919, page 1. This so-called Hematic League, with headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, set itself the task of uniting the so-called Hematic peoples, the chief ethnic group of North Africa. One of its leaders, George Wells Parker, made contact with Briggs, and they agreed to support each other. The reference of the Hematic League was removed from the Crusader in the issue of January 1921. The Brotherhoods began inadvertently exposed to the what?
Brotherhood's beginning.
Thank you. Inadvertently expose a degree of identity confusion among its founders. A similar confusion would mark its appeals and its designation of the audience the organization presumed to address. In the next decade, the audience would be transformed from Hematic to Africans, then black people, and finally black workers. Behind the fluctuations, however, was the premise enunciated by Briggs in 1917. Departing from Garvey's plan for a black state in Africa, he advanced the idea that the race problem could be solved by setting up an independent black nation on American territory, considering that the more we are outnumbered, the weaker we will get. And the weaker we get, the less respect, justice, or opportunity we will obtain. It is not time to consider a separate political existence with a government that will represent, consider the advance us, he argued. Briggs, for one, had spun away from the paternalistic project of African colonization and African missionizing that had concerned, quote, race men like Cromwell, Turner, and Du Bois, and his fellow Caribbean, Bladen Garvey, and J. Albert Thorne. It seems fair to say that the African Blood Brotherhood had begun as a revolutionary nationalist organization. It soon, however, came to be influenced by the socialism of Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and state Bolshevism. And once several of its cadre were absorbed into the American Communist Party, it came to be accepted that in both the United States and Africa, the Brotherhood would act as an ideological, organizational, and military vanguard in its closest rapprochement with the CPUSA. It was conceived as a core of a liberating force developed in the hinterlands of Africa and the shock troops of the black and white revolutionary movement in the United States. Finally, the Brotherhood, or at least prominent members of that organization, Briggs, Moore, and especially Harry Haywood, appears to have provided to the party the immediate ideological stimulus for the development of the Comintern's position after 1928 that black people constituted a national question in America. Within a year or two of its founding in 1919, the Brotherhood's leadership in New York and in Chicago was acting on concert with officials of the communist movement in attempting infiltration and or subversion of the UNIA. The leaders of the UNIA having found difficulty in respecting black nationalism, who had conceded the principles of autonomous leadership, and, quote, race-first action, were not the subject of intrigues, public charges, or recriminalization and betrayal. Though several historians have traced the antagonism between the Brotherhood and the UNIA to supposed differences on the issues of the role of socialism and white workers in the black movement, they did not appear to be the crux of the matter. Much of the rancor between the organization was a result of the Brotherhood's insidious tactics, its growing dependency and domination by the CPUSA, and its present attempts by Briggs, Domingo, Moore, and others to unseat Garvey and the rest of the UNIA's black Zionist leaders. According to Tony Martin, Briggs, several cycles of positions reversals towards the UNIA were begun in 1921 in anticipation of the UNIA's first international convention. Briggs offered Garvey a proposition that Garvey, with his international mass movement, perhaps millions strong, should enter into a program of joint action with the ABB, and an obscured organization of 1,000 or 2 for African liberation. Briggs then took the opportunity provided by Garvey's assembled magnitude to do a little recruiting for himself and passes around copies of the ABB program. The next ploy of Briggs' attempt to impose the Communist United Front on Garvey was to have his white communist friends, Rosa Pastor Stokes, address the convention. She I can't say this word. Expedited the Russians' desire to free Africa, and on the on the need for black-white working class unity. She then called on Garvey to take a stand in relations to her communist overture. Garvey was polite but non-committal. The final stroke of Briggs' strategy was to have ABB delegates to the convention introduced a motion of endorsement to the communist program. The motion was debated and tabled. The ABB pinqued at this setback. Then them immediately published a Black Congress bulletin on August 24th, almost entirely devoted to the scrupulous misrepresentation of the UNI convention. Whatever motivates Briggs and his associates might have had this pattern of contradictory approaches to the UNIA would characterize the relations of the two organizations until the dismiss of the Brotherhood in the 1930s. In the party, Briggs, Moore, Haywood, Otto Hall, Fort Whitman, and others found a complementary radical element and a potential international ally for struggle against colonialism and world capital. Within the UNIA, Garvey, felt much more sympathy for the Russian communists than for the Brotherhood and its American communist colleagues. Black people and communism. Let's see. We're on 15 minutes. I think we can do it. In its beginnings, the American communist movement required no social policies with regard to black people. Having been constituted from the rebellious left wing, the socialist movement did not signify for these communists a departure from the presumption that black people were simply a segment of unskilled working class. That's horrible. Moreover, with the American socialist movement drawn predominantly from immigrant, ethnic, and national minorities, the notion of class solidarity was of substantial importance to the movement theoretically and practically. It provided a category of political activity through which the diverse social elements of the revolutionary movement, ethnics and nationalities, workers and intellectuals, could be reconciled, transcending their several particular interests. The absence of such a class consciousness among black people, and in its stead, the presence of a racial consciousness, as seen by earlier American communists, is both an ideological backwardness and a potential threat to the integrity of the socialist movement itself. To the degree that the early movement became aware of black nationalism, that too would be unacceptable. Black nationalism was intolerable to the movement so constantly close to foundering on national and ethnic division. This concern was made manifest by the frequency with which, quote, back to Africa, quote unquote, ideologies were described as Zionist, quote unquote, and compared to back to Palestine. The movements among the Jewish people, a substantial and influential minority in the early socialist movements, the party consequently opposed black nationalism until its own vibrant self-determination emerged in the Soviet Union in 1928. The UNIA, as the strongest organization among black people with a nationalist ideology, was characterized as a bourgeois reactionary group and made a focus on the attack of black nationalism. American racism did not justify the program of black nationalism. European immigrants with other than Anglo-Saxon origins were also targeted as racist abuses and discrimination. Racism then was merely an element of ruling class ideology and white chauvinism, its political position. Thus, the social context of black people was adapted by ideologues in the socialist movement to social experience of European immigrant workers. The Communist parties did not effectively recruit black people until 1921. This change in policy seems to be largely the responsibility of Lenin, and is even more remarkable than we recall that Lenin's name was barely known to any of the national elements in the American movement 4 years earlier. Nevertheless, it was Lenin who raised the black question at the Second Congress of the Communist International in 1920, and it was Lenin who wrote to the Party in America sometime in 1921 expressing surprise that their reports to Moscow made no mention of party work among black people, and urged that they should recognize as a strategically important element in communist activity. Lenin said that. The American Communist Party then began to recruit its recruitment of black people, primarily through radical black intellectuals and nationalist organizers. The nucleus, as we have pointed out, was those who made up the majority of the Supreme Council of the African Blood Brotherhood. Still, the historical, theoretical antecedents of the American Communist parties were on American black people, and its eventual position on black nationalism were substantially drawn from the experience of Russian revolutionists. And the same year that Lenin had addressed the Second Congress of the Comintern, he had written in left-wing communism, a something disorder. To reject compromise on principle, to reject the permissibility of compromises in general, no matter of what kind, is childishness, which it is difficult to consider seriously. There are different kinds of compromises. Here, Lenin was mounting an attack on what he termed left opportunism. That is political action and judgment that used the next of Marx and Engels to criticize and oppose Lenin in the Bolshevik party leadership. The setting was 1920. In Russia, the Civil War was still undecided. And in Europe, the revolutionary movement had been temporarily defeated. Lenin was urging a tactical retreat. Ooh, that makes sense. This document was meant to stem criticism that emerged from other Russian revolutionists who insisted that the revolution must maintain the international arena and scope and could not be secured in one national territory. Through the document and other activities, Lenin hoped to diffuse the left deviationists before they became an unmanageable and disruptive force at the Second Congress and broke the Bolshevik Party's control and direction of the Third International. Despite its logical inconsistency, historical omission, and distortion, and its contradictions of Marxist theory, his document became one of the most significant works of the first decade of the Third International. Much of this was attributed to Lenin's authority in the movement as the world's most powerful communist. But as important as the work's legitimation of accommodation to the world capitalism and imperialism, if provided a pragmatic modus vivendi for communist parties elsewhere to survive while maintaining the illusion of being revolutionary rather than reformist. The thread of Lenin's argument of his political declaration could be traced stylistically to his critique of the left communist in 1918. Then, in writing left-wing, childish, and petty bourgeoisie mentality, Lenin had been forced to defend the development of state capitalist bureaucracy and the Brest Treaty with the Ukrainian government. Substantively, the thread could be found in his characterization of the Revolutionary Party as a vanguard of the revolutionary masses. By educating the Workers' Party, Marxism educated the vanguard of the proletariat, capable of assuming power and leading the whole people to socialism, and directing the organizing the new system, and bringing teachers, the guide, the leader, of all the working and exploited people in organizing their social life without the bourgeoisie against the bourgeoisie. To Lenin, I'm going to look ahead real quick. Hold on. Remember 326. Oh my God. Wow. We have a way to go. 326. We have ways to go. So 326. We have to find a stopping point.
Okay.
326. Right? Okay. The party of the Marxists. Okay, hold on. Where are we at? To Lenin, the party was the predecessor of true historical consciousness and was the true instrument of history. The party was Marxist theory in practice. It did what it did. It did what it did because the proletariat had demonstrated that it was insufficiently class conscious. It followed then for Lenin that opposition to tax defined for itself by the party could only come from two sources: the reactionary bourgeoisie on the right and a pseudo-Marxist petite bourgeoisie intellectuals, opportunists on the left. If in order to survive, the party acting as the state compromised with Germany, Austro-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey, the quadruple alliance at Brest-Litovsk, it should not be accused of compromising in general. The alternative had been continue war and defeat. One must distinguish, Lenin argued, between obligatory compromise, perversion, preservation, and those compromises that transformed one into accomplices and banditry. The Bolshevik Party made only obligatory compromises, except when it made minor and easily redeemable errors. With a bit of sophistry, Lenin declared, what applies to individuals also applies with the necessary modification to politics and parties. It is not he who makes no mistakes that is intelligent. There is no such men, nor can there be. It is he whose errors are not very grave, and who is able to rectify them easily and quickly, that is intelligent. So basically saying errors are going to happen, and you know what? You have to do it. You have to make the errors, and then you have to make them, you have to rectify them. Pragmatically and tactically, Lenin was laying the ground for members, parties, and Comintern in Europe, elsewhere, and assume non-revolutionary positions for the moment. Party members were instructed to join parties, movements, and organization, and to attempt to influence policy towards reformist demands, necessarily intolerable to capitalism. Communists should not rest content with teaching the proletariat is its ultimate aim, but should lend impetus to every practical move, leading the proletariat into the struggle for these ultimate aims.
Good stopping point.
Sure. Let me get my pad. Where is it at? It's over here.
Okay, so we're stopping on page 326. I would like to bring up that they brought up my favorite person, Harry Haywood, and all 800 pages of his autobiography that I read. And I think he is an amazing man. And if you like autobiographies and you like to learn about people and revolutionary actions and stuff that they did, Harry Haywood is the autobiography you want to read.
All right. Anybody else want to come up and have any conversation? Except. What's up, Dooley?
Hey, so is it okay if I talk about like the nationalism thing, or
Sure.
Okay. So when it comes to the nationalism thing, I think that it's only as useful as it counters things. Because when it comes to it not being a counter, it just ends up being something that ends up falling into
Capitalist relations and
similar
replications.
Yeah, it ends up replicating. If it is not a counter to something, it ends up replicating.
It has to be specific, though, too, to its development specifically.
Yeah, I know, and I'm saying that what usually ends up happening is what I have observed, not though. From the history that I have seen, which take with a grain of salt, it has been based on it lacking being a counter, where it usually ends up falling into that.
It falls into a comprador class position that upholds and replicates capitalist relations. That's what Frantz Fanon talks about, the nationalism that he recognized that saw it end up into petty bourgeoisie attachment to bureaucratic capitalism and imperialist capitalism, where it needs to have a socialist character and the removing of the national character into an international character. That's just a brief description and reduction of what it's supposed to be. But yeah, you're right.
Because it's mostly useful because of the power it gives, not really the values it holds. Because the values it holds are only non-problematic when they're a counter. When they are not a counter, they end up just as I don't want to repeat myself. So yeah, I'll just put the period there.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think like here. I don't know. We have to answer the question and find out. Like in one of my groups, we're finding out if the national question is apparent in our conditions. Like people could say yes, but it's still okay to challenge that just to fortify your position on something or realize something or something that was concealed before that you have no knowledge of comes into your advancement to advance your knowledge. So yeah. So that's why I say we should always question these and figure out how these things could apply, you know? An example seems to be Fidel Castro, who was a nationalist until he gained control, even enveloped to Marxism. Yeah, developed, yeah.
Evolved to Marxism.
Evolved, yeah. Developed, evolved, same thing. But yeah. So, yeah, I think we need to look at these things too, because, you know, right now, we have so many different splits and factions right now, and so many fighting over the factions and splits instead of like coming together as like united front with revolutionary potential on these revolutionary positions and groups. Like we I don't know, but yeah. Anybody else have anything else to say before I close it out?
Just much love. Take care.
Much love. Take care. All right, everybody. Do you have anything to say, Joe? Are you good?
Love you, bye.
Love.